September 12, 1944. Special Interrogation Facility, Fort Hunt, Virginia. The autumn rain fell steadily against the windows of the converted estate. Each drop a soft percussion against glass that muffled the sounds of the Virginia countryside. Beyond, inside a sparse interrogation room, General Major Friedrich Von Thoma sat in a wooden chair, his uniform stripped of insignia. His posture still rigid, with the discipline of 30 years of military service. Before him on the metal table lay a series of photographs, black and white images, that his American interrogators had arranged with theatrical precision. They showed assembly lines stretching to vanishing points, vast factory floors where tanks emerged in synchronized rows, production facilities so enormous they seemed to distort perspective itself. Von Thoma, former commander of the Afrika Corps after Rommel's departure, veteran of Poland and France and the Eastern Front, stared at these images with an expression that cycled slowly from skepticism to confusion to something approaching existential dread. He had surrendered at El Alamein in November 1942, had spent nearly 2 years in Allied captivity, and in that time he had heard many things about American industrial capacity. He had dismissed most of it as propaganda. Now, confronted with documentary evidence of what his enemies had built while he fought and lost, he felt the foundations of his professional understanding crumble like sand. "This cannot be one facility," he said finally in careful English, pointing to a photograph of the Chrysler Tank Arsenal. His finger trembled slightly. "This is multiple facilities combined for propaganda effect." The American intelligence officer, a major who spoke flawless German and wore the patient expression of a man who had conducted this conversation many times before, shook his head. "That is a single facility, General. The Chrysler Detroit Tank Arsenal. It covers 113 acres under one roof. At peak production in 1943, it completed one M4 Sherman tank every 60 minutes. 24 hours per day, 7 days per week." He paused to let the number settle. "One tank every hour, General, not one tank per day. As your best factor is achieved, one per hour." Von Thoma said nothing. His mind performed calculations that refused to resolve into sense. The German Reich, at the height of its power, with all of occupied Europe to draw upon, had produced approximately 6,000 tanks in 1943. The Allies had produced over 60,000, 10 times as many. The disparity was so vast it seemed like a category error, a misunderstanding of fundamental terms. Tanks were complex machines, requiring precision manufacturing, specialized steel, intricate assembly. They could not be produced like consumer goods, like automobiles or radios. Except, evidently, they could. The Americans had taken automotive production techniques and simply applied them to instruments of war. And the result was a quantitative advantage so overwhelming it transformed into qualitative difference. Numbers became their own form of superiority. To understand Von Thoma's disbelief, to grasp the chasm between German expectations and American reality, requires understanding how deeply the Wehrmacht's leadership had misapprehended the nature of their enemy. This misunderstanding was not accidental. It was systematic, rooted in ideological assumptions about race, culture, and the sources of military power that had been carefully cultivated over decades. German military theory, particularly as it evolved under Nazi influence, emphasized quality over quantity, the superiority of the individual soldier, and advanced weapons design over mere mass production. They celebrated the Tiger tank, the Panther, engineering marvels that were indeed superior in armor and firepower to anything the Allies fielded. What they failed to understand was that superiority in individual units meant nothing if you could not produce them in sufficient numbers to affect strategic outcomes. The numbers tell a story that German planners refused to believe even when it was presented to them in 1941. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union, German intelligence estimated that the USSR could produce approximately 1,000 tanks per month. This seemed impossible to sustain, and German strategy assumed that destroying the initial Soviet tank force would cripple their ability to continue. But the Soviets actually produced over 6,000 tanks per month at peak capacity, a five-fold underestimation. Similarly, German intelligence estimated that the United States, entering the war in December 1941, might be able to produce 10,000 tanks per year, given time to convert its automotive industry. The actual figure for American tank production in 1943 alone was 29,497 units. In 1944, it was 17,565 units lower because production shifted to other priorities, not because capacity had diminished. These were not merely numbers. They represented a fundamental difference in how societies organized production. Germany, for all its vaunted efficiency, operated under constraints that limited its industrial potential. The Nazi economy was characterized by competing power centers, personal fiefdoms, and an ideological commitment to autarky that meant it could not fully leverage global supply chains. Tank production was distributed across multiple manufacturers, Henschel, MAN, Daimler-Benz, each producing different models with incompatible parts, each jealously guarding its designs and production methods. There was no standardization, no economy of scale, no application of modern management theory. Fritz Todt, the Reich Minister for Armaments until his death in 1942, had tried to rationalize production, but his efforts were constantly undermined by Nazi Party officials who valued ideological purity and personal loyalty over technical efficiency. The Americans, by contrast, approached war production with the same ruthless pragmatism they applied to commercial manufacturing. When the United States entered the war, it possessed the most advanced industrial economy in human history, an economy that had been built on principles of mass production, interchangeable parts, and continuous improvement. Henry Ford's assembly line was not just a manufacturing technique, it was a philosophy about how to organize human labor and capital equipment to maximize output. The arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt termed it, was not metaphor but description. American industry converted to war production with a speed and completeness that shocked even American planners. Consider the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run facility, built specifically to produce B-4 Liberator bombers. Construction began in April 1941. By August 1943, the plant was producing one bomber every 63 minutes. At its peak in 1944, Willow Run employed 42,000 workers and produced 428 bombers per month. Each bomber contained 1,550,000 parts. The facility itself was the largest room under one roof in the world at that time, nearly a mile long. When Charles Lindbergh visited in 1942, he wrote in his journal, "This is a place where mere numbers lose meaning. The scale is beyond human comprehension." German planners, reading intelligence reports about Willow Run, dismissed them as obvious fabrications. No facility could be that large. No production rate could be sustained. It violated everything they understood about manufacturing constraints. But the constraints were cultural, not physical. The Germans believed that quality required craftsmanship, that individual artisans must hand-fit components, that mass production inevitably meant inferior products. The Americans demonstrated that proper design and rigorous quality control could produce standardized components that fit perfectly, every time, eliminating the need for custom fitting. German tanks were built by skilled workers who took pride in their craftsmanship. American tanks were built by semi-skilled workers, many of them women, following detailed procedures that required minimal training. The German approach produced tanks that were individually superior. The American approach produced tanks in quantities that made individual superiority irrelevant. General Major Von Thoma understood armor warfare as well as any man alive. He had commanded tank units in the Spanish Civil War, where he tested German equipment and tactics under combat conditions. He had led armored divisions through Poland and France with the precise coordination that characterized Blitzkrieg at its peak in North Africa. He had maneuvered his forces with the skill born of experience, understanding terrain and logistics and the ballet of armored combat, but he had always operated under resource constraints. Fuel was limited. Ammunition was rationed. Replacement vehicles arrived slowly, if at all. He learned to treat each tank as precious, irreplaceable, to avoid unnecessary combat, to preserve his force for decisive moments. This was the German way of war. Careful husbandry of limited resources, concentration of force at critical points. Operational art compensating for material inadequacy. The Americans fought differently, because they could afford to. A Sherman tank was not as good as a Panther in direct combat. The German tank had better armor, a superior gun, more sophisticated engineering. But for every Panther produced, the Americans produced 5 Shermans. If you lost a Sherman, another would arrive within days. If you lost a Panther, replacement might take months. The mathematics of attrition favored those who could replace losses faster than they accumulated them. Von Thoma had learned this lesson gradually, painfully. Across 2 years of combat in North Africa, for every German tank his units destroyed, 2 more American or British tanks appeared. His forces were qualitatively superior in almost every engagement. They lost anyway because superiority meant nothing when the enemy had functional infinity. The interrogator slid another photograph across the table. This one showed the interior of a tank factory. A perspective down an assembly line where Sherman hulls moved on tracks, while workers installed components with practiced efficiency. The image captured a moment of organized chaos. Hundreds of workers, overhead cranes moving engine blocks into position, sparks from welding stations, the industrial ballet of modern mass production. This facility, the major said, produced 22,234 tanks during the war. The entire German Reich produced approximately 54,000 armored fighting vehicles total, across all types, for the entire war. This one American factory produced more than a third of your complete national output. Von Thoma studied the photograph. He was 64 years old. A professional soldier from a generation that had fought in the trenches of World War I, that had been shaped by the humiliation of Versailles and the chaos of Weimar. He had joined the Reichswehr in the 1920s, when Germany was forbidden by treaty from possessing tanks, had secretly trained with the Red Army in the Soviet Union during the period of German-Soviet cooperation. He remembered when Germany had nothing, when the army made do with wooden mock-ups and theoretical exercises. The rearmament under Hitler had seemed miraculous. Suddenly resources were available. Factories were producing. The army was expanding, at a rate that left traditional officers dizzy with possibility. By 1939, Germany possessed what appeared to be the most powerful military machine in Europe. A force that crushed Poland in weeks and France in months. Von Thoma had believed they were invincible. The belief survived first contact with the British in North Africa. Survived even the brutal realization that the Soviet Union could not be quickly defeated. It survived because the German army kept winning tactical victories, kept demonstrating superiority in combat, kept destroying more enemy equipment than they lost. The kill ratios favored German forces in almost every engagement. German tankers were better trained, better led, operating better equipment. None of it mattered. The British and Americans kept coming, kept replacing their losses, kept attacking, with the patience of those who understood that time was on their side. After El Alamein, after the supply lines collapsed and Rommel retreated and von Thoma's command was encircled, he had surrendered to British forces with the understanding that he had been defeated by logistics rather than combat prowess. He had been outproduced, not outfought. But even then, even in the clarity of defeat, he had not understood the scale. He thought the Allies had concentrated their resources to achieve local superiority in North Africa, that they were stripping other theaters to mass forces against him. The photographs before him told a different truth. The forces that defeated him in Africa were a rounding error, a minor allocation of vast American and British production that supplied multiple theaters. Simultaneously, the Americans were producing tanks faster than German factories produced trucks. They were building landing craft at rates that exceeded Germany's total shipbuilding capacity. They were manufacturing artillery pieces, aircraft, vehicles, weapons of every description in quantities that represented not just quantitative advantage, but a different order of reality. The symbolic weight of the tank, in this moment of realization, cannot be overstated. Tanks represented modernity, mechanized warfare, the industrial age applied to combat. Germany had pioneered tank warfare in its modern form, had developed the tactics and operational concepts that made armor the decisive weapon of World War II. Heinz Guderian, the architect of panzer tactics, had written the manual that every other nation studied. German tanks were legendary for their quality. The Tiger's 88mm gun could destroy any Allied tank at ranges beyond which the Allies could effectively respond. But Germany produced only 1,347 Tigers during the entire war. The Americans produced over 49,000 Shermans. The disparity revealed something profound about the two systems at war. Germany had created a military-industrial complex centered on the military. The needs of the Wehrmacht drove production, and industry served those needs as best it could under resource constraints and ideological interference. America had created an industrial complex that happened to be producing military equipment. The fundamental structures were commercial, profit-driven, optimized for maximum output, and simply redirected toward war production when needed. The American system was not better because Americans were smarter or more dedicated. It was better because it operated according to economic rationality rather than ideological fantasy. Von Thoma thought about the tanks he had commanded, the Panzer Is and IVs that had seemed so powerful in 1941. He remembered the shock when his forces first encountered the Soviet T-34, a tank that was faster, better armored, and more powerfully armed than anything Germany had deployed. The German response had been to design better tanks, the Panther and Tiger, engineering masterpieces that restored German qualitative superiority. But while German engineers obsessed over perfecting each design, the Soviets and Americans simply produced more tanks. The T-34 was mechanically crude compared to German tanks, prone to breakdowns, uncomfortable for its crew. The Americans produced over 57,000 of them through Lend-Lease and Soviet factories combined. The Sherman was similarly flawed: inadequate armor, tendency to catch fire. Nicknamed Ransom by British troops because it lights first time, every time. The Americans produced them anyway, produced so many that losses were meaningless, that commanders could afford to lose 3 Shermans to destroy 1 Tiger, because 3 more Shermans were already en route. This was the American way of war, and it represented a philosophy that the German military mind struggled to comprehend. The Wehrmacht valued expertise, élan, the decisive battle won through superior tactics and training. They were Clausewitzians, believers in the genius commander, who could achieve victory through operational brilliance despite material disadvantage. The Americans were Fordists, believers in systems and processes, in the idea that proper organization could produce victory as reliably as a factory produced automobiles. There was no romance in the American approach, no celebration of individual heroism, just the grinding, inexorable application of superior resources. It was war as engineering problem, combat as production challenge. The interrogator allowed von Thoma to sit with the photographs, to process what they implied. This was not the first time he had conducted this conversation with captured German officers. The pattern was always the same. Initial disbelief, then attempts to find flaws in the evidence. Then slow acceptance as the implications cascaded through everything they thought they understood. About the war, some officers remained in denial, insisting that the photographs were faked, that the numbers were inflated, that German quality would ultimately triumph. Others, like von Thoma, possessed sufficient intellectual honesty to accept uncomfortable truths. The major had found that senior officers, those with actual command experience, were more likely to believe the evidence because it explained outcomes they had witnessed firsthand. They had seen their forces whittled down by attrition. They had called for reinforcements that never came. They had been promised new tanks that arrived in ones and twos, while Allied forces deployed them in hundreds. The photographs did not tell them anything new, they simply quantified what the officers had already experienced. "You understand now," the major said quietly, "why the war's outcome was never in doubt once America entered. Not because of tactics or training or individual bravery. Those things mattered, but they mattered at the margins. The fundamental issue was productive capacity. You were fighting an enemy that could replace losses faster than you could inflict them. That was always going to be decisive." Von Thoma nodded slowly. "We knew America was wealthy," he said. "We knew they had factories, but we thought—" He paused, searching for words. "We thought war was about will, about discipline and courage. We thought soft nations with easy lives could not sustain the sacrifices necessary for victory. We thought you would break. And instead we built 88,000 tanks and 300,000 aircraft and 2,700 Liberty ships." The major's voice was matter-of-fact, reciting statistics that had become routine. "We did not break because we did not have to. Our citizens never experienced real privation. Our cities were not bombed. Our economy grew during the war. We produced weapons and butter simultaneously, which your economy could never do. You should have understood this before you started." The imbalance was obvious to anyone willing to see it, but they had not been willing to see it. Nazi ideology had taught that democracies were weak, that mongrel nations lacking racial purity could not generate true fighting spirit, that Jewish influence in America made them fundamentally unserious about warfare. Hitler had assured his generals that America was a paper tiger, incapable of producing modern weapons, certain to collapse into isolationism when casualties mounted. Even officers who privately doubted the racial theories had accepted the analysis of American weakness because they needed to believe it was true. If America was strong, if the production numbers were real, then the war was lost before it started. That was unacceptable. So they convinced themselves the numbers were inflated, that American equipment was inferior, that German skill would compensate for enemy quantity. The self-deception was not unique to Germany. Japan had made similar calculations, assuming that American softness and aversion to casualties would limit their effectiveness. The attack on Pearl Harbor was predicated on the theory that one decisive blow would cause America to negotiate rather than fight. Instead, it unified American public opinion and unleashed an industrial mobilization that dwarfed Japan's capacity. By 1944, the United States was producing more military equipment per month than Japan could produce per year. The Japanese responded by emphasizing spiritual purity and warrior ethos. As if ideology could compensate for material disadvantage, it could not. Von Thoma looked again at the photographs, at the endless rows of tanks moving down assembly lines, at the workers who built them, many women, he noticed, which itself was notable. Germany had been reluctant to fully mobilize female labor, partly from ideological conviction that women belonged in domestic roles, partly from concern about domestic morale. The Americans had no such hesitations when war required labor. They recruited labor from wherever it was available. The result was facilities like Willow Run, where Rose Munro worked as a riveter and became the inspiration for Rosie the Riveter, the iconic representation of American female war workers. The Germans saw this as evidence of American desperation. In fact, it was evidence of American pragmatism: use all available resources to maximize output. This pragmatism extended to every aspect of American war production. When rubber supplies from Asia were cut off by Japanese conquest, the Americans invented synthetic rubber and built an industry from scratch. When steel needed to be prioritized, they developed substitute materials for consumer goods. When production bottlenecks emerged, they threw money and expertise at solving them with industrial efficiency. The War Production Board, established in 1942, coordinated across industries with a thoroughness that German planners envied. American automotive executives brought manufacturing expertise that government bureaucrats lacked. The result was not elegant, but it was effective. Tanks rolled off assembly lines that had produced Chryslers and Fords just months earlier. The workers who built them learned their trades in weeks, following procedures designed for minimal training time. The Sherman tank itself was a triumph of this philosophy. Designed in 1940, it was not cutting-edge technology even when it entered production. It was deliberately designed for ease of manufacturing, with components that could be produced by multiple suppliers, with tolerances that allowed rapid assembly. With a design that prioritized reliability over performance, the Sherman's engine was literally a commercial truck engine. Several commercial engines, actually, because the Americans used whatever was available rather than insisting on standardization. Different Sherman variants used different engines, different transmissions, different hull configurations. This drove German intelligence analysts mad. They could not understand how an army could function with such variety. The answer was that American logistics were so robust that variation did not matter. Spare parts were abundant enough that mechanics could simply replace entire components, rather than repair them. Von Thoma had commanded Panzers in combat. He loved those machines with the particular affection that professional soldiers develop for reliable equipment. The Panzer IV was a good tank, well designed, effective in its role. He knew each one by its quirks, the slight differences in how they handled, the particular sounds their engines made. He knew which commanders were most skilled, which crews most reliable. He managed his forces with the care of a man for whom each loss was irreplaceable. The idea of treating tanks as disposable, of accepting losses because more were available, was alien to his experience. Yet that was how the Americans fought. And they won doing it. The philosophical difference was profound. German doctrine emphasized combined arms coordination, the skillful integration of tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support to achieve breakthrough and exploitation. This required training, leadership, initiative from junior officers, trust between branches. It was an art form that the Germans had perfected. American doctrine was simpler. Apply overwhelming force at every point. Use material superiority to compensate for any tactical deficiencies. Accept casualties because they could be replaced. It was inelegant, brutal, effective. The Americans did not try to outmaneuver German forces. They simply crushed them with sheer weight of metal. After Normandy, after the breakout from Hedgerow country, American forces swept across France with a speed that stunned German commanders. They did not pause to consolidate positions or protect flanks as doctrine suggested. They simply advanced. Supplied by an unending stream of trucks, the Americans produced over 2.3 million trucks during the war that delivered fuel and ammunition faster than German forces could interdict them. When German counterattacks did occur, American commanders called in artillery and air support in quantities that made defense impossible. At the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last major offensive, the Wehrmacht concentrated forces with desperate skill, achieved surprise, drove deep into American lines. For a moment it seemed like German operational art might yet achieve miracle. Then the weather cleared, Allied aircraft filled the skies, and the offensive collapsed under the weight of American material superiority. The Germans fought brilliantly. They lost anyway. Von Thoma understood this now, sitting in a room in Virginia, looking at photographs of the industrial capacity that had crushed the Reich as surely as any military defeat. The war had not been lost on battlefields. It had been lost in factories, in the decisions made in the 1930s about economic organization, in the choice to pursue autarky rather than global trade, in the ideological commitment to racial theories that limited access to talent and resources. Germany had built a military machine adequate for fighting European wars against comparable powers. They had not built an economy capable of fighting the United States. The error was fundamental. And by the time it became apparent, correction was impossible. The tank, in this calculus, was both symbol and substance. It represented industrial might, technological sophistication, the capacity to project power through mechanized warfare. Germany had excellent tanks. America had adequate tanks in overwhelming numbers. The difference was decisive. Every Sherman rolling off an assembly line was an argument against German ideology, physical proof that democratic capitalism could outproduce fascist autarky, that mongrel nations could organize more effectively than racially pure ones, that free markets could mobilize resources more efficiently than command economies. This lesson was not easily absorbed. Von Thoma, like many German officers of his generation, had been raised in a culture that celebrated military virtue, that believed spirit could triumph over material disadvantage. The mythology of Frederick the Great, who had fought wars against multiple enemies with limited resources, loomed large in German military thought. Prussian tradition emphasized discipline, training, the supremacy of the offensive spirit. These were not wrong lessons. Exactly, spirit and training mattered, especially at tactical levels, but they were incomplete. Modern industrial warfare required resources on a scale that transcended individual courage. The Americans had understood this intuitively. The Germans had learned it through defeat. As the war drew to its conclusion, in 1945, as American and Soviet forces converged on Berlin from east and west, German commanders experienced the final revelation of their miscalculation. The streets of German cities were clogged with American vehicles, jeeps, trucks, tanks, half-tracks, all in such abundance that they seemed to have metastasized across the landscape. American soldiers were well-fed, well-equipped, casual in their confidence. They did not look like conquerors straining at their limits. They looked like workers doing a job, competent and unhurried, backed by resources so vast that this campaign was merely one among many. In the Pacific, America was simultaneously crushing Japan. In supply depots across Europe, equipment sat unused, produced in quantities beyond even American capacity to deploy. The arsenal of democracy had not just met wartime requirements, it had exceeded them, had produced such abundance that the challenge became distribution rather than manufacture. Von Thoma was not present for Germany's final collapse. He remained in Allied custody, was eventually transferred to a more permanent power facility, was repatriated to Germany in 1947. He returned to find his country destroyed, divided, occupied. The Third Reich, that was supposed to last 1,000 years, had endured 12. The military, that was supposed to be invincible, had been utterly defeated. The ideology that promised greatness had delivered catastrophe. He settled in Bavaria, wrote memoirs that were honest about German failures, refused to indulge in the myth-making that characterized much German post-war military literature. When younger officers sought his insights, he told them about the photographs he had been shown in Virginia, about the moment when he understood that the war had been lost before it truly began. "We fought bravely," he would say. "We fought skillfully. We achieved tactical victories against superior numbers. And we lost, because we were never fighting a military war. We were fighting an economic war, and the outcome was predetermined by relative productive capacity. The Americans could build tanks faster than we could destroy them. That was the war's fundamental truth. Everything else was details." In the decades after the war, As historians studied the conflict and drew lessons for future military planning, the production numbers became almost cliché. The arsenal of democracy. The miracle of production. The home front victory. These phrases smoothed over the brutal simplicity of what had occurred. One side could produce weapons and vehicles faster than the other could destroy them. Attrition favored the side with greater reserves. Economic capacity determined military outcomes. These lessons seemed obvious in retrospect, but they had not been obvious in 1940, when Germany controlled most of Europe and Britain fought alone. They had not been obvious in 1941, when Hitler's forces drove to the gates of Moscow and American entry into the war seemed distant and uncertain. The lessons became obvious only through experience, through the slow grinding realization that courage and skill were necessary, but insufficient conditions for victory. The tank remained the central symbol of this realization. It was the weapon system that defined World War II in the European theater, the instrument of blitzkrieg and armored breakthrough, the tool that made mobile warfare possible. Germany had pioneered its use. America had perfected its production. The contest between German quality and American quantity was decided not on battlefields but in factories. In the decisions about how to organize production, how to train workers, how to balance precision against speed. The Americans made different choices than the Germans, choices that sacrificed individual excellence for collective output, and those choices proved correct. General Major Friedrich von Thoma died in 1964, having outlived the Reich by 19 years. His obituaries in German newspapers were respectful, noting his military service and his reputation as an honorable officer who had fought according to the traditional codes of warfare. There was no mention of the photographs he had studied in Virginia, no reference to the moment when his understanding of the war shifted from tactical to economic. That moment remained private, a personal reckoning with truths too uncomfortable to easily share. But in his memoirs and in interviews with historians, he returned repeatedly to the theme of production, to the understanding that modern war was decided by industrial capacity rather than battlefield prowess. The legacy of American tank production extended far beyond World War II. The techniques developed to mass-produce Shermans influenced post-war manufacturing across industries. The management systems refined in tank factories became standard practice in American business. The workforce that learned industrial skills building weapons formed the backbone of post-war prosperity. The lesson that organization and systems could overcome individual limitations became central to American military doctrine. In subsequent conflicts, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, American forces consistently enjoyed overwhelming material superiority. The legacy of production systems developed to win World War II. But the deeper lesson was about the nature of power in the modern world. The tank, that symbol of industrial age warfare, demonstrated that military strength ultimately derived from economic strength, that the capacity to produce determined the capacity to wage war, that ideology and training and courage were all subordinate to the fundamental question of resources. Germany had tried to build military power on a foundation of ideological purity and racial hierarchy. America had built military power on a foundation of industrial capitalism and pragmatic efficiency. The contest was not close. The side that could produce one tank per hour defeated the side that could produce one tank per day, not because their tanks were better, but because they had more tanks, always more tanks. An inexhaustible supply of adequate equipment that rendered enemy excellence irrelevant. This was the truth that von Thoma had confronted in that Virginia interrogation room, the truth embedded in those photographs of assembly lines and factory floors. The images were not propaganda, they were evidence. They proved that the war had been lost not because German soldiers lacked courage or German commanders lacked skill, but because the German economic system could not compete with the American economic system. The war's outcome had been determined by decisions made in peacetime about how to organize society, how to allocate resources, how to structure production. By the time shooting started, the result was already written in the industrial capacity of the combatants. In the silence of memory. In the years after the war, when old soldiers gathered to remember and explain, the tank endured as symbol. It represented the moments when quantity became quality, when individual excellence was overwhelmed by collective capability, when the old certainties about war gave way to modern realities. The photograph of assembly lines stretching to infinity, of Shermans emerging in synchronized rows, of American workers building instruments of war with the casual efficiency of people assembling autumn. These images captured something essential about the 20th century. They showed that industrial civilization had transformed warfare from art to engineering, from individual combat to mass production, from the skilled warrior to the efficient factory. The Americans had understood this transformation and embraced it. The Germans had understood it and rejected it, preferring mythology about Germanic warrior spirit to mathematics about productive capacity. The price of that rejection was total defeat. The destruction of cities, the death of millions, the permanent stain of genocide, the division of the nation, and in the aftermath, in the quiet moments when surviving officers tried to make sense of what had happened, they returned to the tank, to the disparity in production, to the realization that they had been fighting an enemy who could replace losses faster than inflicting them became meaningful, to the understanding that they had lost before they began. The rain continued to fall against the windows in Virginia, steady and patient, washing the late summer dust from the leaves, cooling the earth. Inside, General Major Von Thoma gathered the photographs into a stack and pushed them across the table toward his interrogator. He had seen enough. He understood now. The war had not been won or lost in the deserts of North Africa, or the forests of the Ardennes, or even in the factories whose images lay before him. It had been won and lost in the decades before, in the choices societies made about how to organize themselves, what values to prioritize, what kind of world to build. America had built a world of abundance, wasteful perhaps, undisciplined by German standards, but capable of producing tanks at rates that defied belief. Germany had built a world of discipline and hierarchy and martial virtue, elegant in its way, but incapable of matching American production. The better world had won, not because it was more virtuous, but because it was more productive. The tank, emerging from assembly lines at impossible speed, represented that victory: industrial, democratic, abundant, overwhelming. It was not the victory anyone would choose to celebrate in poetry or song. It was too mechanical, too impersonal, too dependent on logistics and manufacturing rather than heroism. But it was total, it was decisive. It was the future, rolling forward on treads, one every hour, 24 hours per day, until the enemy was buried beneath weight of numbers and the truth could no longer be denied. In modern war, production was power, abundance was strength, and the nation that could build fastest would triumph regardless of whose soldiers fought most bravely. This was the lesson of the tank. Learned too late by those who needed it most, understood too clearly by those who won. April 3, 1944. Camp Shelby, Mississippi.